My name is Jane Sprenger, and I was born in New York City in 1917 at 801 West End Avenue in an apartment where I was born. And there's something interesting about that. And that is that my mother knew that I was coming, and she called the doctor. Well, she told the doctor that she was expecting me at her home at West End Avenue because people didn't go to the hospital in those days. And so he said, Mrs. Gordon, I have a very important operation tomorrow morning. Could I spend the night at your house? And she said, certainly. So he came with this nurse. And the nurse told me that he would get up and come in when I was ready to deliver the baby. But I didn't want to disturb him. So the baby was born with the doctor asleep in the next room. And I lived there until I was about 6 years old in an apartment, and then we moved to Central Park West. And I remember lots of things about my childhood in New York because it was very different than what things are like now. My favorite activity as a teenager was to take the Fifth Avenue bus on the top and ride all the way up the Hudson River Parkway and see all the sights, and then go back to Fifth Avenue, and with a friend we would go to a place called Schrafft's and have ice cream and chicken sandwiches. Since that time, I have lived in many places because I married a Navy person in World War II. And we moved, I lived in Norfolk, I lived in Portland, Maine, but my main residence was San Francisco. And when I was there, I acted as a nurse's aide. And that was interesting too, because all the nurses were conscribed into the service. And I and a 73-year-old nurse were the only people on the floor. So I did everything, including helping in surgery, even though I didn't know what I was doing. Also, the other interesting thing that happened to me there, I happened to go to school with a girl who married into the Levi Strauss family, who make Levi's. And they sort of adopted me as their war daughter. And I learned how the other half lived, which is a very, very unusual, different place than where most people are. And when I came back home to see my mother, she said, you better forget about this because it doesn't last after you leave there. Then in Norfolk, which I stayed for quite a while, one of the main things I remembered is living in a housing development for Navy wives. And it was in a big field. And there were so many mice in the house that I couldn't wait to get out and away from that place. And I used to sing in the solos in the church, and the admiral and all the high desk people would come up and tell me, thank you, which I didn't really deserve. Then I moved to San Francisco, where I stayed for 5 years, and my son was born there. But also, I sang for the troops, and I was part of a group that went in a big truck to all the naval bases. And I sang 2 songs. That was all. It was part of an oleo. And the 2 songs were Alice Blue Gown and I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas. And they all clapped and hooted and yelled, and of course, that was fun. And then I came back east because I wanted to see green grass. And it was pretty soon after that I came up to Vermont and fell in love with Greensboro. And we lived here in the 50s, the late 50s. And finally, after 4 years of trying to get a house, we moved into a house that was owned by Miss I can't say her name now. That's a senior thing. You have to excuse me. But anyway, the house was very crooked because it had heaved over so many winters and nobody had ever fixed it. So finally, we were told by Henry and Kim I. Hoggart that we really should take the house down and build a new one. And I was very friendly at the time with Heidi Eigelhart and lots of young kids that liked to come to my house and bake cookies. And we built up this story about, I lived between 2 Davises. On one side was a professor, and on the other side were just Davises. But they were not very compatible people, and they were always arguing. And there was a piece of rock that seemed to echo when they go up and down their stairs. So what happened, we told the workmen that the house was haunted. And there was a man that kept on getting on this piece of board, and the board would slap him. So he said to his friends, let's burn the house down. And they almost killed all our trees. But they survived, and the new house is still here, and my son now uses it. And I live on Country Club Road in a beautiful big field with views of hills and valleys, and it's a very nice, wonderful place to be. And I had a lot of fun redecorating the house. And I love being here. And my favorite companion is my dog. During my youth in the 60s, I was terribly involved with civil rights. And I had some rather exciting, wonderful experiences. We did all kinds of things. We marched on Washington, and all the buildings on the roof had soldiers with armed guns ready to shoot you if you did anything untidy. They also sprayed us once, which wasn't very nice. But we kept on going, and there was a senator by the name of Perrin Mitchell, and Perrin wanted us to go to this armory where the White Citizens Council were going to have a meeting. And he wanted us to fill it with people so that there was no room for the white citizens to get in, which we did. But the white citizens came anyway, but there were so many police there, mostly soldiers, I should say, with armed guns, that they departed and didn't have their talk. And we did a lot of testing of houses and restaurants. A bunch of white people would go to a building that was renting, and they would say, oh, we'll show you this one and this one. And then we would send a black couple, and they'd say they had nothing. And then we would go to a restaurant, and the black people would come in and join us, and they wouldn't serve us. So we would report all these things. And we started our own little group called the League for Human Rights. And I thought we needed some kind of a pep talk from the authorities. And I wrote a handwritten letter to Johnson, who was president at the time, and told him that I knew he was too busy, but could he at least send us a message? Well, the next meeting we had was at a big church in Baltimore. And a man came in and asked for me. And he said he was Senator Lawrence. And he had been sent by the president to talk to us and say how proud he was of us for the things we were doing. So although I never got a written thing from him, I said he did actually send someone. And I said, where did you hear about this? He said, well, I was on Air Force One going to Texas. And he said, you know, you can do me a favor. This group in Baltimore that wants some pep talk. Will you please go and tell them I send my best regards? And we did a lot of things, like the Berrigan brothers, who went to the steel country of Pennsylvania to fight the war of segregation, etc. And we went up there, and that was a very interesting thing because they were guarding all the entrances to the courthouse, and you had to be very careful when you went in because they examined everything in your purse. And the man opened my purse, and there was all kinds of food in it. And he started pulling it out. He said, oh, for goodness sakes. He put it all back in. He said, go in. Didn't bother. And we used to go down into the ghetto of Baltimore. And that was, to me, a wonderful experience because some black person would always come and walk with me and sort of protect me. We also, my oldest friend and I decided that we would help the Black Panthers with their breakfast for children. And that turned out not to be such a good idea because I was much younger then, and he decided he wanted me for his woman, one of them. And they were getting very, very personal. So we had to quit. And it was a very exciting time. And although when we were doing these things, we didn't realize that there actually was progress. Looking back on it, we know we made progress. The thing that was very sad, and I hope it doesn't happen again, once the demonstrations were over, the black people did not want to be considered white, and they would not associate with us except in very limited groups. There were some would, but some didn't want anything further to do with us. I think the message for young people is that you just keep on doing what you know you can do, and don't expect miracles because they don't happen fast. It's a slow process, and it has to be, because even the blacks and the whites and now the Muslims have to learn how to accept the fact that there is always going to be people in the world who are against them. It's just the way it is. But we can, by making strides, we can make it much easier for people. And I would also say that it's very important that we get some Democrats back in the White House. I was an avid horse person. I love horses to death. And I first had my horses in Pennsylvania, where they at a stable. But when I wanted my horse to be in New York, so he was on 65th Street. There was an armory and a stable. I don't know if they're still there. The armory probably is, but I'm not sure of the stable. But I could take my horse into Central Park across the street and ride him on the bridle paths that were specifically made for horses. And then one day, my horse got bitten by another horse. And I wanted to make sure he was all right, so I stayed at the stable and slept in the stall with him for a couple of nights. But I did a lot of horse show riding. And one of the big things that I did was to ride in Madison Square Garden in a dressage thing. And there were 6 sets of contestants. Each one had 6 people in it. And we did our performances. And then they gave out the awards, and we got 6th place. It's like very bottom. But we were excited anyway. My horse's name was Playboy. And he was a very, very wonderful horse, because there was this very expert man by the name of Mr. Duncan who tried to train him. And he used a whip, and the horse just bucked him off every time. And so one day he said, "Jane, get on this horse." So I did, and we bonded right away. And he followed me around like a dog and nuzzled up against me. And I got to a point where I just said things to him. I didn't touch the reins at all. And he responded. But he would not accept other people. And I rode in a lot of good hands classes. And I always won. And it wasn't fair, because they would make us change horses. And when we changed horses, I would get some old polite horse that did whatever I said. And they would get Playboy, and he was very pesky. He wasn't nice to them. He wouldn't canter, or he'd start galloping. He was just not, he was a one-person horse. That was just before World War II. That when I had my horse in New York. And then unfortunately I got married, and I had to follow my husband all over the country. and I had to give my horse to someone. Well, I've been married several times, but my best marriage was number 3. We won't go into the others. And he was someone from Tennessee, far from the ocean. And we met, and he was taking mail order lessons in how to sail. And he finally passed with flying colors, and they wrote and said they never had anybody who responded perfectly to everything. Well, anyway, he purchased a boat, a sailboat, 30-footer, called a baba, which has a rounded hull. And he took that boat first to the Caribbean, and I went all over the Caribbean with him, and we learned a lot about sailing. However, I was always anxious to get ashore. I didn't really like it out there all that much. But he finally decided he was ready to go around the world, single-handed. So off he started, and his first stop was in Ecuador. And I went down there, and we visited Ecuador, and it was very exciting to go to Ecuador. And we went out to the island, and they don't allow people to go visiting the islands unless you have someone aboard. See, this was a rest area, so he could still be single-handed. And so this man took us to this place where the mangroves had built around a little section that was completely confined from the ocean. And he said, let's get in the dinghy, and when we get to the edge of the island, we'll all have to duck down and go inside. And we went inside this place, and there were birds in there and fish of all kinds. And they were not the least bit afraid of us because they'd never seen humans. He told us that very few people had ever been in there. And that was very exciting at the Galapagos Islands. And then from there, he took the boat to Tahiti, and from Tahiti to New Zealand and Australia. And I flew and joined him at all of these different places. And we finally ended up in Africa, and that was very exciting. And then we went to Brazil, which is sort of a sad place. There's so many poor people, and they're treated like animals as if they weren't worth saving. It's a tragedy in many ways, but it's also a beautiful place for those who can afford it. However, it's a very dangerous place, and we were told at night when we left the boat that we should not have any money on us, and if we wore watches, to leave them off, because we'd be robbed, which is sort of weird, but we went so many islands before that we'd had that kind of experience. And Africa was really exciting. And this is a very interesting thing that happened that I was not part of. But when we were in Durban, and he was going down along the coast to, what's the name of the...
Cape
Yeah.
Cape Town?
Yes. And they said they wanted a picture of the bottom of the boat because when you're going down that way, the wind blows away from the islands and from the land. And so they want to know what the boat looks like if it's upside down. And then, then I met him and that was a very exciting trip. And the man who followed Guinness's Book of Records, he was the 100 and something, I think 49th person to go around the world by himself. And he said, you know, Jane, we should have something for you in the Guinness's book, because I don't think anybody else has ever followed a sailor on an airplane. So that was a lot of fun. But he just loved it. And when we came back to Baltimore, someone asked if he would like to do it again. And he said, sure, I know the way now. Well, I went down to see Janet Long's mother, and she was very busy on the phone, and there was a man standing there. And she said, oh, for goodness sakes, I'm glad you came. And she said to me, Jane, he's going to ask you some questions. He's from the New York Times in Boston. So I said, fine. So he said, well, what have you got to tell me about Rehnquist? And I said, well, he's a very likable man in some ways, but I'm a little bit disturbed about him being the first Chief Justice. And so he asked me why, and I said, well, it seems that when he lived in Arizona or wherever it was out west, he lived in a house that would not allow Indians to be in that area. And then he moved up here, and he moved into a house behind the lodge that said no Hebrews. And I think that the Justice of the United States should be a little bit more careful. And I know that you cannot erase those things from the deeds, but you can say it is no longer applicable. And it never said that. And the excuse was that it was up to his lawyers. He didn't read those things. And I don't think that's a very good excuse. And so that particular article got all over the United States through this man. And I got all kinds of letters telling me, hooray, hooray. So anyway, that was my Rehnquist story. But there's a funny one about him too. And that is that at the lodge, there were a bunch of men that used to eat lunch. And they called themselves the Romeos. Tired old men eating out. But I think that we know that he had some humor. But he evidently antagonized some of the help because he wanted to sit in a certain place. And they said that table was full. And he said, well, get them to go someplace else and let me sit there. And the help wouldn't do it. And I think that was great. The driving story is they called it Jane's Road. I had just moved into this house on Country Club Road. And it had snowed overnight. And everything was a plateau of white. There was no barriers by the snow on either side. You couldn't tell where the road was. And I looked and I saw these telephone poles. And I thought, that must be the road. So I drove straight into the field and got stuck, of course.
No, you didn't. You made it through.
So they called that Jane's Road.
You didn't get...
And people would come to look at the road that I had built. Her father, Everett Lyles, and Ernie were very good friends. And they would love to be naughty. That was part of their personality. And I found this thing, which was a beef advertisement. Only it was a beautiful girl, and it showed all where her soft places were, where her chops were, etc. And they just absolutely couldn't have enough of it. They used that, they put it up in the garage, and they would laugh over it, the two of them. Of course, it was my fault. I helped them. I think if we know what is in the past, we can understand the future much better. And it's very hard sometimes to make a judgment about things that have happened a long time ago because people just didn't think the same way. And although their thoughts were limited, this is not because they were bad people, but because they didn't understand the right way to do things. And I think that this is very good for young people to know. And I can give you an example of that I think is quite wonderful. Mrs. Sigmund Stern, who was the Grand Dame in San Francisco and gave the concerts to the Golden Gate Park. She was a member of the Levi Strauss family. She called me during the war and said, would you get people to come to a Christmas dinner at my house? And I said, sure. She wanted military people. So I immediately started thinking about who I'd ask. And the phone rang again. And it was Mrs. Stern. And she said, Jane, I know I sound funny, but would you mind getting officers? Now, here was a woman who was really great, but she had her limitations because of the way she had been raised. And it's only through history that you can learn these things. Because it's exciting to know what went behind you. This year, it has been a little difficult because winter was too long, but mostly I love it because winter is a snuggling, cozy, intimate time when there aren't too many outsiders here, and you feel the warmth of the local people who are so much more outgoing than they are in the summertime when there's so many strangers. And I think that it is wonderful to have the gorgeous falls that we have. And the summer is so lush. You can't say too much about spring because it's kind of iffy. Only, I don't mind mud season, except my car objects. And I wish that they could take some of the bumps out of my road because I'm going to lose what few teeth I have left. It is terrible. I must tell you also that when my mother was alive, we looked for a house that was on one of the back roads. And this is a wonderful story. And we had, I'm trying to think of the people's names. There was it was a house down where the plumber lives.
Rod Kerr, was it the Hall House?
That road. And we had this lawyer who was looking for property for us, and your mother was the real estate lady. And we looked at this house, and we were going to buy it. In fact, we had given a deposit to your mother. And unfortunately, the lawyer died. So we had to wait for 6 weeks until we could get on with another lawyer. And then one of the people who owned the house died. And my mother was getting very edgy. Then, about 6 weeks after that, the wife died. And my mother said, Jane, if you want the house, it's yours, but I'm not going to live in it.
Oh, dear.
I spent a lot of time wandering in my younger days up Bar Hill and getting blueberries. And it's such a beautiful view up there. And I think it's worth preserving. I hope we can keep it the way it is. And Caspian Lake is just a great place. I just wish that we could have what we had years ago when the same families came up all the time. And unfortunately, life has changed so much that the women are also working and they don't bring their young people up here. But it was a much more intimate place than it is now. But that's progress, and I guess we can't change it. But I think Caspian Lake is just beautiful. Greensboro is a treasure, and anyone who delves into it knows that it is that. However, like all of these wonderful little towns that look so happy on the outside, when you get to know the local people, their lives are not all that happy. But somehow there is an optimism among people. Maybe it's the fresh air, I don't know. But people just don't give up. They just keep on going and going till it can't go anymore. And I think that is a wonderful way to live. Because life is really exciting. And I know one of the things I want to live for is to see Trump out of the White House.
That's what she looks forward to.
In fact, all of his people, they're terrible. I'm looking forward to being around a little while longer, and I hope I can stay in this house and take care of myself.